Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Share Green Design podcast. Today, we have a very special guest with us, Dafni Filippa, and she will explain a bit more in detail what she does. But before all that, I would like to explain why she's a very special guest. And it's because we started, or we heard about her a number of years ago, maybe 3 or 4, I can't remember. So one of the first projects we published on our students section on the website at the beginning, was from her, and then she did another one. She studied a master, we published another project, then she won a competition, so we also posted. So we've been in touch for a number of years. We never met face to face, even though it's online. So thank you very much, Dafni, for joining us, and welcome to Share Green Design podcast.
Thank you so much, Han, for having me. It's an absolute honor, and as you said, it's a very special connection for me because it was the first time someone published my work. So you were the first kind of to find me when I finished my bachelor's, and you've been also following me throughout my academic career. So now I'm working in a practice. So it's a really great time to talk about everything. And thanks so much again for inviting me.
I think it's great for us because we've been already live for a number of years. So see that progress, that when we approach students to share projects and then people like you become professionals and really good professionals in what they do, I think it's brilliant to see that progress in your career. So you're an architect, and we'll talk a bit more about your background a bit later. But your area of expertise is biourbanism. So could you explain a bit for everybody that don't know what that is, because it sounds like a weird word, and it's not that many people, I guess, working on that. Could you explain a bit more to our audience?
Yes,
please?
Sure. It sounds, like you said, like a very complicated word, but it's actually very simple. So biourbanism, it's an area I'm working on in McGregor Coxall as a senior strategic designer. And in order to talk about biourbanism, first, it's really important to understand, because it refers to cities, it's really important to understand cities as dynamic organizations, or even better, as assemblages. And by looking outside and understanding the cities as these dynamic organizations, we can really start to identify the different systems and different entities that compose the cities, but also their evolving boundaries and morphology. So this unique communication and interaction between the system is essentially what biourbanism explores and investigates. And specifically in my area, it's this metabolism. So if we again stay in the systems thinking and we think of the cities as dynamic organizations, it's really interesting what happens, because the behavior of the individual system starts to change once they perform as the whole. And there is a lot of theories in academia about assemblage theory, obviously, but it's really great to take this part from academia and put it into practice. And there are not many companies that do this, especially since it combines not only architecture but landscape architecture, urbanism. It combines sociology, psychology, geospatial analytics. So it's an interdisciplinary approach, and it can also be seen as a model practically when designing. It's really both. And in my work, I focus more on the approach. So I work in designing and really exploring the symbiosis between the urban and the natural systems. Everything in the background is obviously for us climate change and climate emergency. So biourbanism really responds to these challenges faced in the urban environment and achieving, in the end, prosperity. One thing I would like to add within the work that we do in biourbanism is this very close relation. I mean, I did talk about metabolism a bit, but for me personally, also within my work in the previous years, is really important to talk about this close relationship of biology and landscape. So thinking of landscapes as similar to a human body, composed by different organs and performing as a whole, is really key when designing, because it allows us to start thinking about the interlinked entities and systems when we approach a project, and not just segregate it and only design it for a specific with specific boundaries, really. And within that, I mean, obviously, it's really important to think about contextuality and how these organizations changed and shaped morphology when we changed the context entirely. But biourbanism, if I sum up in the end, it's really about the relationship and the metabolism between urban and natural systems, and how can we design for that to address climate change and also socio-political emergency.
Oh, that sounds super interesting. And you talk about interdisciplinary, or we can say multidisciplinary collaboration in the end. So I guess you work with, when you are involved in a project, you work with many different professionals from different backgrounds, as you said earlier. And I think you referred to as well your relation, you keep your relation with the academia. So your work, I guess, is a step between, or not a step, is linked to academia, but also the real world. So could you explain a little bit more how that works, your research, and how that is applied to real projects?
Yes, so coming into practice, I didn't feel right to call myself an architect or a landscape architect. So the reason that I didn't want to do that is because I see landscape architecture and architecture as one discipline, and even better, when designing within cities, we shouldn't segregate the disciplines in kind of in different places, and that's the reason as well why in the company when we have a project, our teams are composed from people with different backgrounds. So for me, the area of expertise is strategic design, and it applies obviously to architecture and landscape, but it derives from systems thinking. So it's very similar to how I explained about biourbanism, that it really looks at the relationship between systems within the urban environment, and it uses different tools when designing. So it's both research, it's academia, it's experimentation and visual thinking. And it really helped me to, coming from academia, to still keep part of my research and develop it further within the practice. And that's not an opportunity many graduates get. So I'm really happy to be in this position. And things that I started within my projects and how I was approaching design to be able to take this further. And also it's something that's celebrated within a company as my own design identity, and that means a lot to me.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of projects are you involved at the moment? I mean, not on the research side on the academia, but more on because I think what would be interesting, at least for me, and I guess for the audience as well, is how all those ideas can be materialized into something that can benefit, as you said, climate change and make the cities more resilient as well.
I cannot talk so much about the projects themselves because of NDAs, but most of them, they address responsive landscape systems and landscape infrastructure to address climate change. So one of the things that I started in academia was to look at landscape prototypes using geogrids and geomembranes. So this is something that I'm still exploring in practice. And when engaging into a project, it's also about the design thinking that goes into it. So there are two aspects for me. There is the drawing the concept, and I use one of my main tools is drawing, and we can talk about that later. And the second part is the material. So for me, it's imperative when you design for a specific context to really engage with the contextuality and materiality, because this is what creates a successful design in the end.
Yeah, I think that context is critical as well, because each place is different, and it's how you apply your principles to that specific location.
Yes.
Because otherwise there is no single answers, I guess, on biourbanism that we can extrapolate.
Exactly.
And you talk about your clients and NDAs. I guess something like this that sounds like a very strategic. Your clients would be mainly public clients.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
Yes.
And their motivations would be mainly determined by climate change or future proofing, resilience, or
sustainability. Yeah.
Okay. And do you work mainly because you are based in the UK? I understand.
Yes, we're based in the UK, but our practice works globally. So the projects that I have right now, they're distributed across the world. We have projects in Finland. We have projects in Middle East. So they're really in Australia. So it's really mixed in terms of the scale as well, which is really great, because then you can engage with large scale, but also small scale in terms of how you design and how you engage with the material on site.
I think you gave a couple of examples there, Finland and Middle East. I don't think you could have mentioned two more opposite landscapes
Yes,
to work with.
exactly. But that's great, right?
Yeah, it is, and that's why. So you would have to collaborate and engage with local professionals as well. So could
Yes.
you tell us a bit more about how that works at practice, working globally, engaging with local professionals as well?
Yeah, so one of the first things that we do, I mean, thinking of the competition we have now in Finland, is engaging with local landscape architects as well. So we we invite them to view our concept and also give us their kind of give us their thoughts on how we approach design, because it's really important to have people on site, and especially if you can't travel yourself, which is really important to do, but obviously through coronavirus it was really restricted. But we engage also with local communities. So within McGregor Coxall, because we're interdisciplinary, we always design together with the local community and council. So it's not just that we propose the design and then it is what it is. So it's really a participatory process, and that way it also allows us to learn more about the context where we're designing, and also about the people who they will be using the landscape in the end. So they have to be happy about it in order to sustain it for the future. So that links really well to the aspect of resilience, sustainability after the design is finished. And the landscape architects or the architects, they've left the site because the design still has to go on, and it still has to be sustained.
And I think in your work as well is life. So because when you think on a building, most of the times there are just fixed elements and they just age. I think with landscape and biourbanism is something different. It evolves. So you have to plan for that, and it requires the engagement of the community. I think that's very important as well.
Exactly, and that's the big difference. I mean, I can argue that buildings are also in movement, in constant movement, but landscapes especially, and it's really hard for us when we draw a plan to show it to the client and we say, this is how it's going to look like, because it's really not. When the most beautiful, I think, photograph you could take of a landscape is really 10 years after you've built it, and that these life cycles are what really fascinates me in my work. And I've been always thinking about the aspects of something growing, something decaying back in the landscape and coming back as a different form. So that's this is the ever-changing dynamic and movement caused by the natural systems, and sometimes unfortunately this is restrained within urban settings, and we can see this, with climate change, with flooding and flood surges. So this is what biourbanism tries to do, to achieve that symbiosis and work with the natural systems rather than against them.
And I think that brings back to your background a little bit, because you've mentioned already you're an architect and a landscape architect. Could you tell us a bit more and your interest in architecture first, the relationship, your holistic approach to design?
Yes.
And the contextualization of your design and how you ended up then doing a master in landscape and then biourbanism?
Sure. So I knew I want to start the architecture. I was very young already. I think I was 12. It sounds very cheesy, but it's really true, because the school I was in, it was built using sustainable materials and a sustainable approach. So I remember while I was there, I was starting to draw, and I had already kind of a small portfolio of what I would like to design when I'm older. So then it was really clear I loved as well maths and science and physics and drawing. So I also used to be a ballet dancer. So all these aspects for me, the sense you have for a place, it was very clear that I have to be an architect. So I went to Germany for that. I didn't stay in Greece. Originally, I'm from Athens, but I went to the Technical University of Munich, and I studied there for 5 years. And one of the years as well, I went to the University of Bath for my Erasmus. But within my studies in the TUM, I really learned to be a good designer in terms of having discipline. Really learning a lot about how things are built and having a lot of technical knowledge, which was really important before I unleashed my creativity, in my master's when I did my landscape architecture degree. And I think somewhere midway through, when I was studying architecture, I realized my love for landscape, just because every time I was designing something, the influence I had was always from the context and the landscape. So I had the urge to design that around it as well. So it was really hard for me to just design in a footprint and a boundary, because I always viewed the energies on the side as the most important fact of the concept. And it was not always easy to be allowed to design that actually at the tomb, because of this kind of very disciplined and technical field. But the first time I was allowed to was in my bachelor thesis. I was taught by Francis Queret back in 2020, and this was also the first project you published. So it was the project in Ghana. And that really viewed the design both as a landscape and as a building. And then me wanting to explore that further, it was very clear that I want to do a master's in landscape architecture. And I chose to go to the Bartlett in UCL, since it's one of the top universities, but also because I knew about the creative process within that. And transferring from the tomb to the Bartlett was a very different experience, but I started to develop my own language when designing, and also drawing practice, the hybrid design practice, what I call it, because if you see my work from the Bartlett, it's all the drawings and all the models that I created, they have a specific identity. So I found who I am as a designer through that. And then coming into the practice, I knew that I want to combine both my degrees in architecture and landscape architecture.
And I think also an important part of that is I think you're very talented and gifted at drawing, modeling, even from an artist point of view, and you've won an award for that, or more than one on drawings. Could you tell us a bit, because it's not only about the ideas that you are talking about, it's how you represent those ideas and you communicate to the world.
Yeah, so I used drawing as a medium to design. So I never saw drawing as an end product of a design project. I always designed by drawing additional layers on top, and quite often my drawings seem very complex, but they're really not if you close your eyes and you imagine all the energies and forces that are present on a site. So the drawings, they represent both the seen but also the unseen, and that's what makes them a hybrid, because it's it's almost like the speculative and the tangible merging as one. And then the second part of that is the physical modeling. So it's not just drawing on a digital canvas and being completely separated from the reality. Is really going into the site and thinking about the materials. So my drawings are composed normally from a digital drawing and then from a scanned 3D model. So quite often in my design projects, I build the prototype. It was either casted, and then I also I worked a lot with materiality. So I 3D printed. I spanned membranes. I did lots of things just to try to understand the dynamics of the site and really engage myself with the materiality. And then having that prototype, which was the tangible aspect, I 3D scanned it and then put it back in the computer and then finished the drawing. And one of those in Fluid Strata, it was also the moment where it won the World Architecture Festival prize, the Architecture Drawing Prize 2021. So it was exhibited at the Stone Museum, and that's a drawing which is a casted model and also a digital model, which also you published later in your platform as well.
Yeah, and I think that drawing in particular, I think it captures everything you've been describing. And I remember the first time I saw that drawing that I didn't understand it. To be honest,
Yes.
it was a beautiful drawing. But then as you look at it in more detail, you can start seeing, and maybe you can describe to our audience what the drawing is about and what is this place, because it's on our website. I think if you can just they can just search by your name. Or we can even, I think when we post your podcast, we'll add the links to the projects we've published,
yeah,
and the drawing and everything. So, but could you explain a little bit on that drawing and the different layers that
Yes.
it has.
So the drawing is based on the project Fluid Strata, which is situated in London, and it's a very speculative project. It says, or it imagines that in 2100, the Thames Barrier is not in operation anymore. So there is a huge flood surge coming in London, and it addresses flooding. So I picked a site which was the Victoria Tower Gardens next to the Westminster Abbey, and underneath of that site, there is one of London's lost rivers. And I don't know if you know, but London has a huge network of underground rivers, and I don't want to say lost because they're still there. Some of them are confined in sewers, but they're still there. So these rivers became my core inspiration and core agent to guide the flooding out of the city. So the drawing is speaking about the deep ground, and it's viewing the deep ground as this extended territory which becomes architectural. So it's a casted prototype, it's a casted model of the deep ground, because obviously I couldn't visit it, so I had to somehow imagine how it is. And within that, within my project, I envisioned a set of responsive membranes which perform according to the tides, and they absorb the incoming water. So it becomes, landscape becomes an infrastructure, and it also engages with deep ground natural processes. So the drawing is made through various layers. The core one is the model, which is also photographed using a black background, really, like with an iPhone. So it was not really that spectacular in terms of resolution. But then all the layers that come on top, they represent ground processes. They represent unseen forces, and also very kind of detailed stratigraphic elements. So in the end, it's a hybrid composition, and that's why I submitted it also in the hybrid category. And it's really representing my approach to design as well, through looking at relationships between systems and metabolism between entities.
And the other one, the other project you mentioned earlier as well, I think it would be good if you can explain a bit more. And again, it's published so people can look at it.
Yes.
But you mentioned that was your thesis. I think that was the first project we published as well from you in Ghana. And I think that's what I remember that project. I have it I can picture it in my head now. And it's, well, as you said earlier, I don't think you can call it a building. It's landscape architecture. I don't even know how to describe it, but it's obviously integrated. So could you talk a bit about that as well?
Yes, so that's one of my favorite projects, because it's very personal to me, and also it links to how I went from architecture to landscape architecture. But what it really does is that, unfortunately, we couldn't visit the site because it was throughout Corona. But me and Miriam, we designed this together. So we were looking at photos of the site, and we saw this very strong dynamic and kind of historical significance of Ghana, and the culture of the people as well, and how they were using the spaces. So we really wanted to celebrate that. So this project is all about celebration, and celebration of Ghana and celebration of Accra. And the first thing we did is we read this very dense urban fabric of the city. And because the site was positioned on the waterfront, it was positioned right next to a natural formed isthmus, which is almost like an island. We wanted to take that energy and start to deconstruct it and decompose it into a landscape until it reaches the sea. So take something that is very, dense and rigid, and then transform it into something very fluid. And to do so, we positioned what we called activation points, which are circular notations. And you can see this in the plant because they become public squares. So these squares, they influence how the buildings around are formed. So it's almost like you're reading that tension from the landscape and how this informs the architecture. And normally we have buildings from the landscape, but actually in this case we have the landscape informing the buildings, which is also how it should be, and how in the future, combining landscape architecture and architecture, I would like to take this forward. But the project is about celebration. It's about viewing the building as a landscape. And as well, using local materials. So it was we experimented a lot. We did a one-to-one prototype of a wall, and there are a lot of studies, I mean, out there about concrete. And instead of using the coarse aggregates, to use wet bamboo chips. So that was one of the innovative materials that we proposed, and we did some tests with that. So we built a one-to-one wall. So there were a lot of aspects of materiality going into that, but yeah, the most important thing was about the conception of the building as a landscape.
And I think that's very important, and you can tell when you see that design that it belongs. And I think that's something very important nowadays as well with design, and in the context of climate change and carbon, that everybody's talking about carbon. I think one of the best ways to cut carbon emissions is, as you said, using local materials, because it adapts better, and it's understanding the culture and the social aspect of where you're working on and the climate and everything. So it's not, I think, and that's a much richer and interesting approach to, I wouldn't call it architecture or to design, yes. I don't know, to whatever we want to call it, as opposed to another approach that maybe has been more predominant in architecture, which is a building as an object,
yeah,
that you just place wherever you are building, and especially during all these years of globalization that we've seen that happening a lot, that you could see almost the same building, as you said earlier, Finland and Norway, or Finland or the Middle East, or it could be somewhere in Asia. And the design you're talking about is the opposite approach.
Yeah, and there's so many problematic aspects of what you're just talking about the architecture as an object. Also, in terms of how buildings, how people circulate in the site, and how they find the entrance, like very simple. But then also issues in terms of how the building is adaptable and it's resilient to climate change. So I think bringing it back to biourbanism, that's what really the approach is trying to do, is to almost force people to think of all the systems that are on the site. So it's not just about one thing. It's about thinking where this entity is linked to, and what this really means for the overall performance of the design. And yeah, there is in biourbanism, I mean, there's something I've been working on specifically and developing called social fingerprint, and it's that aspect that every place and every city has a very distinct behavior that then is referred to as social fingerprint. It's almost like these systems, they behave in a specific way, which is also an inherent agency in the end, and this helps designers to identify the how they should approach design with that specific context.
And could you tell us, because that approach, we've seen that more and more, and we've published some projects from students that have that approach, and they understand the context where they're working on, which is fantastic to see. But could you tell us about your inspiration and architects or designers or artists that inspire you, that have been a reference for you?
Yes, for sure. I mean, the first one I'm going to say is, I mean, unfortunately he passed away, but it's Enrique Miralles. And I remember seeing his drawings for the first time, and his drawings were my inspiration in terms of how he always spoke about not only designing a building, but reinventing the site with it. And that was so inspirational when I read it back. And I remember looking at his work throughout my bachelor's. And this is also something, I mean, going back to the drawing practice that I always try to do. So when I have to draw the design, I always pick one hero element, which is normally a natural system, and it's very unique to that specific context. So this becomes the hero of the composition and the drawing that the concept is designed around, and then everything else revolves around it. And this speaks to all the previous work I've done in academia. So it's really also how through the drawing and the composition you arrive to this final design. Because as I said, for me, this is my main tool of approaching design through drawing as provocation, or drawing as a medium, or drawing as a thinking device.
And if you were to set up your own practice today,
yes,
how would you call yourself? What would be your job title?
Diaspora. So that's a Greek word talking about movement, and would be an interdisciplinary practice between landscape architecture and architecture. So I wouldn't position myself only in one discipline, but it would really study relationships between buildings, landscapes, and natural and urban systems with the background of climate change.
And how that links, because now that you are working in the practice and you see also how the construction industry works, or maybe design industry, where there are so many professionals working together, and each one, and the more developed a society is as well, the more split the responsibilities are. So how do you see your role? Because you have a completely different approach. You have that holistic approach, and you are able to see the building from many different angles. So how do you see that working in reality with all that many layers of professionals and regulations and codes that you have to comply with?
I think because it's a very new field in terms of practices, really doing, adopting this holistic approach, it's going to be more in terms of engaging with a lot of competitions. So one of the most important things for me would be to actually develop a physical prototype of my work, because again, staying only in theory, as we know, at some point, there is no actual application. And especially that's the issue with from being in academia and then coming into practice, is to realize the research that you've been doing. So that would be my first step for sure, and that makes the work also able to compete with these other practices that are already out there, and they're realizing parts of the design, even if they're segregated in disciplines, it doesn't matter, because they're testing stuff on site. So the first step is to do the research, develop a prototype, and actually build it in one-to-one scale.
And so how would you see that coming? Would you need partners or help to build those prototypes? Are you collaborating with someone to do that?
Yes, and that's why I always keep a very close relationship to academia, and potentially, thinking of a way to PhD at some point, because you need the facilities and the expertise of people engaging, in laboratories, and having the expertise of actually building things in one-to-one scale. So it will be a collaborative approach, and that's the great thing about strategic design as well, in my role, that I'm almost curating the design by also pulling the right people in that have the expertise that I don't have, because that's also okay. You don't have to know everything. You just have to also be able to recognize that and speak to the right people, and always, be open to learning new approaches and new things.
I think that's a very mature approach to, for someone at the end, that you understand what you can't do, and I think that's brilliant. So, and I was actually going to talk about to ask you about that is, let's say someone that's listening and they want to collaborate or engage with you or help you on what you are doing. How could they engage with you? Could they reach out to you and say, I don't know, if you're talking about a PhD, for example, I don't know if you have decided already where you want to do it, or you are looking at different universities to do it. So
yes, I've had people reach out to me through social media, but also through emails, and I always tend to respond to these because they're really important partnership for the future potentially. So regarding the PhD, I'm looking at various universities, potentially staying in Europe, Switzerland, just being in a cutting edge university in terms of facilities and laboratories, so that I will be able to realize the prototypes I've been speaking about before. But yes, definitely, I would say reach out, and both using my email address or social media, and I would really happy to take forward future collaborations.
Okay, and then that I can see something else will be published in the future as well, your PhD and the research, and hopefully the prototypes, because I think people, talented people like you that work in the academia and in practice, I think I understand academia is very important and the research, but I think as important or more is getting all those learnings so we can apply in the real world, so we can all benefit from that. So hopefully you'll have an opportunity for that.
Yes, and I forgot to mention this, but the way McGregor Coxall approached me, and specifically Michael Cowdy, the director in the UK, he contacted the Bartlett. He needed a student to help with a competition. So there are practices that have a very strong relationship with academia, and this is the way. I was the first one to come from the Bartlett. Now we have almost 5-6 people from there. So it's opening doors. And working at the same time while completing my master's allowed me to be both, in a practice and see how things work when you have a client and how you really realize things. But then still keeping my mind in research and imagining and dreaming about all the designs that I would like to do. So that was a really good transition for me to start working the last months before completing my master's. Although it was really hard in terms of having no time, but it was really worth it in the end. And it led to this incredible position here. So I'm really happy.
Okay, thank you. And just before we finish, what would you say to, I think in your case, you're very young, obviously, but what would you say to students that are younger than you, that are already at college and they don't know what path they would follow? Or, as you said earlier, architecture, landscape architecture, what would you say to them? What would be your advice for younger people that to do in the future if they want to do something similar to what you're doing?
Obviously you don't have to just choose one. You can choose everything, whatever you want. And it's really the approach of what you want to achieve. So for me, if I wanted to do both landscape and architecture, so that's why I did specifically the bachelor's in architecture and then my master's in landscape. But my advice would be to be provocative, to always, draw your ideas and to not be afraid to show them, because even if you receive criticism, there are people that actually understand your work. And I've had this happen to me a lot of times. So find one thing, similar to what I said about drawing, find one thing that is the hero, and then everything else revolves around it. So one thing that you're really passionate about, and then build everything on that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think that's a good way to finish our podcast today. And I love that passion as well. So
yeah.
Thank you very much for your time, Dafni. And I'm sure we'll publish more of your work. And hopefully we'll be able to catch up in a few years to see your progress.
Thank you so much, Juan, for inviting me, and really looking forward to having a podcast maybe in 5 years' time and letting you know how I'm getting on with everything.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.